Some people think money gives them the right to decide who matters. The words had barely left Richard Coleman's mouth when several guests around him laughed politely, eager to stay on the good side of one of Manhattan's most influential CEOs. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom of the Hawthorne Charity Gala, casting golden reflections across polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed guests. The annual event attracted executives, investors, politicians, and social elites from across the city. Every table was decorated with fresh white roses. Every conversation seemed to revolve around success, power, and reputation. Standing quietly near one of the refreshment stations was Danielle Carter, a 45-year-old black woman wearing a simple navy dress and carrying a modest handbag. She looked comfortable, calm, and completely uninterested in competing for attention. Most people passed by without noticing her. Richard noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not seem to fit the image he expected at an event like this. As Richard crossed the room holding a fresh cup of coffee, he glanced toward Danielle. His eyes lingered on her simple outfit. His expression shifted into the faint smile of someone who believed he had already figured out everything about another person. Moments later, as he approached a group of executives, he suddenly turned. The movement was careless. The coffee spilled forward, splashing across the front of Danielle's dress. Several nearby guests gasped. Conversation stopped. Danielle looked down at the dark stain spreading across the fabric. The coffee was warm, but her expression remained composed. For a brief second, everyone expected Richard to apologize. Instead, he examined the stain and shrugged. Then came the comment that changed the atmosphere of the entire evening. Maybe next time choose a place that fits your budget. A few nervous laughs echoed through the room. Others looked away uncomfortably. Danielle slowly raised her eyes toward him. Her face revealed neither anger nor embarrassment. She simply studied him. Richard seemed irritated by her calmness. Most people would have argued. Most people would have defended themselves. Danielle did neither. She reached into her handbag, removed a folded napkin, and quietly dabbed the coffee from her dress. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. One young waitress standing nearby looked horrified. Another guest shook his head slightly, but said nothing. Richard straightened his expensive jacket and returned his attention to the executives beside him, apparently satisfied that the moment was over. Yet something lingered in the room. Danielle's calm reaction unsettled people more than outrage would have. The young waitress stepped forward carefully. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Danielle offered a warm smile. "I will be fine." Her voice was gentle, steady, genuine. The waitress nodded gratefully. Around them, conversations slowly resumed. Music drifted through the ballroom once again. Glasses clinked. Laughter returned. But the energy had changed. Danielle moved toward a nearby window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city lights sparkled against the darkening evening sky. She looked out across the buildings for several quiet moments before glancing back at the crowded room. Richard was already entertaining another group with stories about business victories and corporate success. Danielle simply watched. Then a small, almost unreadable smile appeared on her face. Not a smile of revenge, not a smile of anger, a smile of patience. Because while everyone else believed the evening's story had already been written, Danielle knew something they did not. And before the night was over, the entire room would discover how dangerous assumptions could be. Danielle Carter remained near the window long after most people had forgotten the incident. Beyond the glass, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of lights, each one reflecting against the river like scattered stars. Inside the ballroom, conversations grew louder as guests returned to discussing business deals, investments, and social connections. Yet Danielle seemed completely unaffected by the attention she had briefly received. She folded the napkin carefully and placed it back inside her handbag. The stain remained visible on her dress, but she treated it as though it were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. A few guests glanced toward her occasionally, curious about why she had not reacted. Most people would have demanded an apology. Some would have caused a scene. Danielle simply stood with quiet dignity. After several minutes, she made her way toward the restroom. The marble hallway leading there was lined with elegant artwork and soft golden lighting. Inside, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The coffee stain stretched across part of her dress. She ran cool water over a cloth and gently cleaned what she could. Her movements were calm and practiced. There was no frustration in her eyes, no sadness, only patience. A woman standing nearby watched her for a moment. "I am sorry that happened to you," she finally said. Danielle smiled politely. "Thank you." The woman hesitated. "You handled it better than most people would." Danielle folded the cloth. Anger rarely improves a situation. The woman nodded slowly. The answer seemed simple, yet somehow meaningful. When Danielle returned to the ballroom, the evening continued as though nothing unusual had happened. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and appetizers. Laughter echoed from small groups gathered throughout the room. Danielle accepted a glass of water and quietly found a place near the back of the ballroom. There, she observed people, not with judgment, with curiosity. She watched executives compete for attention. She watched politicians exchange rehearsed smiles. She watched wealthy donors discuss generosity while ignoring the employees serving them. The longer she observed, the more the evening revealed itself. Near one of the banquet tables, a young waitress accidentally dropped a stack of folded napkins. Several guests stepped around her without stopping. One man frowned impatiently. Another simply walked away. Danielle immediately crossed the room. "Let me help," she said. The waitress looked embarrassed. "Thank you. I am sorry." Danielle knelt and gathered the napkins beside her. "There is nothing to apologize for." The waitress smiled with visible relief. "You are very kind." Danielle handed her the last napkin. Everyone needs kindness sometimes. Unbeknownst to Danielle, someone nearby had noticed the interaction. Richard Coleman stood across the room speaking with a group of executives. For a brief moment, he watched Danielle helping the waitress. Something about her composure bothered him. He could not understand why. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected anger. Instead, she moved through the evening with a quiet confidence that refused to break. Danielle returned to her place near the window. Outside, the city lights continued to shine. Inside, the gala carried on. But beneath the elegant music and polished conversations, something had already begun to shift. And before the night was over, the people in that ballroom would discover that the woman they had overlooked possessed far more strength than any of them realized. As the gala continued, Richard Coleman moved effortlessly from one conversation to another, surrounded by people eager for his attention. The ballroom had become his natural habitat over the years. Wealthy investors laughed at his jokes. Corporate executives nodded at his opinions. Politicians shook his hand with practiced enthusiasm. Everywhere he went, people seemed to reinforce the same belief he had carried for most of his adult life. Success could be seen, measured, and recognized immediately. To Richard, appearances were often the first and most reliable source of information. A tailored suit suggested competence. An expensive watch suggested achievement. A luxury car suggested influence. He rarely questioned those assumptions because they had served him well in the business world he understood. As he stood near the center of the ballroom discussing a recent acquisition, one of the executives beside him glanced toward Danielle Carter near the windows. "Who is she?" the man asked casually. Richard followed his gaze. Danielle was speaking quietly with an elderly guest, listening more than talking. The stain on her dress remained visible, yet she appeared completely unconcerned by it. Richard smirked. "I have no idea." Another executive chuckled. "She does not seem like the usual crowd here." Richard lifted his glass. "Not everyone understands where they belong." The group laughed politely. Yet even as he spoke, Richard found himself looking toward Danielle again. Something about her continued to bother him. She should have been embarrassed. She should have left by now. Instead, she moved through the evening with a confidence that made no sense to him. Across the room, Danielle listened patiently as the elderly guest shared a story about his late wife. Her attention never drifted. She never looked over his shoulder searching for someone more important to speak with. When he finished, she smiled warmly. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." The man nodded. She was. There was gratitude in his eyes. After he walked away, Danielle returned to the window overlooking Manhattan. The skyline shimmered beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. She seemed perfectly content standing alone with her thoughts. Richard noticed this too. The longer the evening progressed, the more her calmness unsettled him. Most people attended events like this hoping to gain something. Connections, opportunities, recognition. Danielle appeared interested in none of those things. Nearby, Two young entrepreneurs approached Richard seeking advice. He spent several minutes discussing leadership, ambition, and success. The conversation naturally turned toward reputation. People judge quickly, Richard said confidently. That is reality. The smartest people learn how to present themselves correctly. The entrepreneurs nodded. One of them glanced toward Danielle. Do you think first impressions are always accurate? Richard barely hesitated. Most of the time. At that exact moment, Danielle turned away from the window and caught sight of a hotel employee struggling to carry several heavy boxes toward a service entrance. Without drawing attention to herself, she crossed the ballroom and held the door open for him. The employee smiled gratefully. Danielle smiled back. No cameras recorded the moment. No important guests applauded. Yet somehow the simple gesture carried more authenticity than many of the conversations happening throughout the gala. Richard watched from across the room. He could not explain why, but the sight irritated him. Because every minute Danielle remained composed, his assumptions felt a little less certain. And for a man who had spent his entire life trusting those assumptions, uncertainty was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The gala moved deeper into the evening as more guests arrived and conversations became increasingly animated. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers while waiters navigated carefully through clusters of executives, donors, and socialites. Danielle Carter remained remarkably unchanged by the energy surrounding her. She neither sought attention nor avoided people. She simply moved through the room with quiet purpose. Near the center of the ballroom, a young server carrying a tray of sparkling water suddenly froze. One of the glasses tipped, sending a small splash across the sleeve of a prominent guest. The young woman immediately looked terrified. Her face turned pale as she began apologizing. Several nearby guests exchanged impatient looks. One man rolled his eyes. Another muttered something under his breath before walking away. Danielle noticed the scene from across the room. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. It is all right, she said gently to the server. Accidents happen. The young woman looked relieved to hear someone speak kindly. Danielle accepted a napkin from another employee and helped clean the small spill before it became a larger problem. The affected guest, seeing Danielle's calm approach, relaxed almost immediately. Within moments the situation was resolved. The server whispered a sincere thank you. Danielle smiled. Everyone deserves a second chance. Several people nearby witnessed the interaction. Most returned to their conversations. A few watched Danielle with growing curiosity. One elderly donor who had attended the gala for years quietly observed her from a distance. He had noticed something unusual throughout the evening. Whenever there was an opportunity to elevate herself, Danielle ignored it. Whenever there was an opportunity to help someone else, she stepped forward. Across the ballroom, Richard Coleman continued entertaining a circle of influential guests. Yet even while speaking, he found his attention drifting toward Danielle again and again. He could not understand why she remained so composed. The coffee incident should have embarrassed her. His remarks should have pushed her toward anger. Instead, she appeared more comfortable than many of the wealthy people surrounding her. That realization irritated him. Eventually, Richard approached another group of executives near the buffet tables. The conversation quickly shifted toward success and social status. One guest casually mentioned how difficult it could be to identify truly influential people at large events. Richard laughed. Trust me, he said confidently. You can usually tell within 5 seconds. Several people chuckled. At that exact moment, Danielle happened to walk past carrying a glass of water. Richard glanced toward her and smirked. And sometimes even faster. A few uncomfortable laughs followed. Danielle heard the comment. So did several nearby guests. Once again, she stopped briefly and looked at Richard. There was no anger in her expression. No desire to argue. Only a calm curiosity that somehow made his words feel smaller. Then she continued walking. The lack of reaction unsettled Richard more than any confrontation could have. As Danielle returned to the large windows overlooking Manhattan, she paused and admired the sea of lights stretching across the city. Reflections shimmered across the glass. Behind her, the gala continued with all its elegance and noise. Yet beneath the polished surface, the balance of the evening was slowly changing. Richard still believed he was judging Danielle. What he failed to realize was that everyone around him had quietly begun judging him. The evening continued unfolding beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, Yet the mood around Richard Coleman had begun to change in subtle ways he failed to notice. Conversations still followed him. Guests still laughed at his stories. Executives still sought his approval. But scattered throughout the ballroom, more people were quietly paying attention to Danielle Carter. Not because she demanded attention, but because she never seemed to need it. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. Near the main stage, a keynote speaker finished a short presentation about leadership and community impact. Polite applause filled the room. Guests returned to their tables and resumed networking. Danielle remained near the windows overlooking Manhattan, occasionally speaking with other attendees who approached her. Every interaction followed the same pattern. She listened more than she spoke. She asked thoughtful questions. She remembered details about people she had met only minutes earlier. Several guests walked away from those conversations feeling unexpectedly valued. Richard observed this from across the ballroom. The sight irritated him more than he cared to admit. He had spent years building influence through power, reputation, and success. Danielle seemed to create the same effect simply by treating people with respect. Eventually, Richard found himself standing near a group of major donors discussing future projects. The topic shifted towards social status and professional success. One guest remarked that true influence often revealed itself quietly. Richard laughed and shook his head. "Influence is visible," he said confidently. "People know who matters the moment they enter a room." Several guests nodded, though not as enthusiastically as before. Richard glanced toward Danielle again. She was helping an elderly woman locate a misplaced event program. "Some people are very good at pretending," he added. The comment was not directed at anyone specifically, yet everyone understood who he meant. A few uncomfortable expressions appeared around the group. Meanwhile, Danielle located the missing program and handed it to the grateful woman. "Thank you," the woman said warmly. Danielle smiled. "You are welcome." The simple exchange lasted only seconds, but it left another positive impression on those nearby. As the gala moved closer to its final hours, the city skyline outside grew even brighter. Reflections danced across the ballroom windows. Soft music drifted through the air. The stain from the coffee remained faintly visible on Danielle's dress, a quiet reminder of how the evening had begun. Yet somehow it no longer seemed important. What mattered was the character each person had revealed since then. Richard approached the refreshment station and poured himself another cup of coffee. For a brief moment, he watched Danielle standing alone near the glass. She appeared completely at peace. That calm confidence continued to bother him. It felt as though she knew something he did not, as if she were waiting patiently for a moment that had not yet arrived. Across the room, Danielle reached into her handbag and removed her phone. The screen illuminated softly in her hand. She typed a short message, paused, then pressed send. A small smile touched her face before she slipped the phone away again. No one noticed except Richard. For reasons he could not explain, the sight made him uneasy. Outside, thousands of lights stretched across Manhattan like stars scattered beneath the night sky. Inside, the gala continued with polished elegance. Yet beneath the music and conversation, something important was approaching. Danielle knew it. Richard did not. And the distance between those two truths was growing smaller with every passing minute. The gala had entered its final stretch, yet Danielle Carter seemed untouched by the exhaustion that often settled over events like this. She remained near the towering windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the city shimmer beneath the night sky. The lights from distant buildings reflected across the glass, blending with the warm glow of the ballroom behind her. The faint coffee stain on her dress was still visible, though most people no longer noticed it. In many ways, the stain had become symbolic. It remained present, but it no longer carried power. Around her, guests continued exchanging business cards and discussing future opportunities. Laughter drifted across the room. Crystal glasses caught the light. Soft music floated through the elegant space. Yet beneath the polished atmosphere, a quiet sense of anticipation had begun to grow. Danielle felt it. The elderly donor she had spoken with earlier felt it as well. Even some of the employees seemed aware that the evening was moving towards something important. Richard Coleman, however, remained focused on maintaining control of every room he entered. Standing near a group of executives, he continued discussing investments and leadership strategies. Yet his confidence no longer appeared quite as effortless. More than once, his eyes drifted toward Danielle. Each time he found her exactly where he expected, calm, patient, completely at ease. It frustrated him. Most people reacted to humiliation. Most people sought validation. Danielle appeared interested in neither. A few moments later, one of the event coordinators hurried across the ballroom, carrying a tablet. She stopped near the entrance, checked something on the screen, then spoke quietly into a radio. Her expression immediately changed. Several staff members suddenly became more attentive. A subtle ripple moved through the room. Most guests failed to notice. Danielle did. She glanced briefly toward the entrance before returning her attention to the skyline. The small smile from earlier returned to her face. Across the ballroom, Richard noticed that smile. The uneasiness he had felt all evening returned. He could not explain why. Nothing obvious had happened. No announcement had been made. No important guest had entered. Yet the atmosphere felt different. Nearby, two donors quietly discussed rumors about a powerful figure expected to attend the gala later that evening. Neither knew whether the rumors were true. The possibility alone seemed enough to spark curiosity. Danielle listened without participating. She simply held a glass of water and gazed out at the city lights. A notification appeared on her phone. She looked down briefly. The message contained only 3 words. On my way. Danielle locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her handbag. Her posture never changed. Her expression never shifted. Yet for the first time all evening, there was a subtle warmth in her eyes. Near the ballroom entrance, additional staff members quietly positioned themselves. The event coordinator straightened her jacket. A hotel manager appeared from a side corridor. Several guests began noticing the unusual activity. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Richard followed their gaze toward the entrance. The massive doors remained closed, but anticipation now hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Danielle remained perfectly still beside the window. Outside, Manhattan sparkled beneath the night sky. Inside, every passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last. And somewhere beyond those doors, the person Danielle had been waiting for was finally about to arrive. The massive ballroom doors finally opened, and the quiet anticipation that had been building throughout the evening instantly transformed into complete silence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter disappeared. Even the musicians seemed momentarily distracted as dozens of heads turned toward the entrance. A tall man stepped into the ballroom, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit. He moved with calm confidence rather than showmanship. There were no dramatic gestures, no attempt to command attention. Yet attention followed him anyway. Several prominent executives immediately straightened their posture. A city official who had been speaking near the stage suddenly paused. 2 influential business owners exchanged surprised glances. Richard Coleman watched the reaction unfold with growing confusion. He recognized the man. Almost everyone in the city recognized him. Marcus Carter. His name carried enormous weight throughout business, philanthropy, and private investment circles. People often described him as the most feared man in the city, not because of violence, but because of his unmatched influence, his relentless standards, and his ability to destroy careers simply by refusing to do business with those he considered dishonest. Richard had never met him personally, but he knew his reputation well. Marcus rarely attended public events. When he did, people paid attention. The ballroom remained silent as Marcus moved forward. Several guests stepped aside instinctively. Event organizers hurried to greet him, but Marcus acknowledged them only briefly. His attention appeared focused elsewhere. Richard assumed Marcus was heading toward one of the major donors near the front tables. Instead, Marcus continued walking past executives, investors, and politicians without stopping. The room watched in disbelief as he crossed the ballroom directly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Danielle Carter turned from the glass just as Marcus approached. For the first time all evening, her expression softened completely. Marcus immediately noticed the faint coffee stain still visible on her dress. Concern appeared in his eyes. He removed his suit jacket and gently placed it around her shoulders. "Sorry I am late," he said warmly. Danielle smiled. "You made it." The simplicity of the exchange somehow carried more power than any speech delivered that evening. Marcus glanced at the stain again. "Long night." Danielle laughed softly. "Interesting night." Around them, shock spread across the ballroom. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Marcus Carter knew Danielle. Not casually, not professionally, personally, very personally. Marcus placed one hand lightly over Danielle's. I was worried I would miss you. Danielle shook her head. You know I am patient. Several guests now stared openly. The elderly donor who had spoken with Danielle earlier smiled knowingly. The young waitress looked stunned. Richard struggled to process what he was seeing. Finally, one executive near the stage spoke the question everyone else was thinking. Mr. Carter, he said carefully, how do you know Ms. Carter? Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Then he smiled. His answer was simple. She is my wife. The words landed with the force of a revelation. Silence swept across the ballroom once again. Richard felt every confident assumption he had made throughout the evening collapse at once. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was not standing beside one of the most influential men in the city by accident. She belonged there. And suddenly, everyone in the room understood what Richard had failed to see from the very beginning. The silence that followed Marcus Carter's words seemed to absorb every sound in the ballroom. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The city lights beyond the windows continued shining across Manhattan, but inside the gala, time itself appeared frozen. Richard Coleman stood motionless among the guests, staring at Danielle Carter as though he were seeing her for the first time. In many ways, he was. The woman he had dismissed with a glance, mocked with a careless remark, and judged without knowing anything about her now stood beside one of the most respected and influential men in the city. Yet what unsettled Richard most was not Marcus's reputation. It was the realization that Danielle herself had never changed. She had been the same person all evening. Calm, patient, kind. Marcus looked around the room and quickly sensed the unusual atmosphere. His eyes returned to Danielle. Did I miss something? He asked quietly. Danielle smiled softly. Only a lesson. Marcus studied her expression. He knew her well enough to understand that she was choosing her words carefully. Before he could ask another question, the elderly donor stepped forward and greeted him warmly. Several other guests followed. Soon a small crowd had gathered around Marcus and Danielle. Yet despite the attention, Danielle remained exactly as she had been before. She listened more than she spoke. She thanked people for their kindness. She treated every employee who approached her with the same respect she offered the most powerful guests in the room. Richard watched every moment. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Finally, after several minutes of internal struggle, he began walking toward them. Each step felt heavier than the last. Conversations gradually quieted as people noticed where he was going. When Richard reached Danielle, he stopped. For the first time that evening, he appeared uncertain. Gone was the confident executive who believed he understood everyone at first glance. In his place stood a man confronting his own reflection. Mrs. Carter, he said quietly. Danielle looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes. That somehow made the moment even more difficult. Richard took a slow breath. I owe you an apology. The ballroom became silent once again. Richard lowered his head slightly. I judged you the moment I saw you. I assumed things about you that were not true. I treated you with disrespect, and I am ashamed of it. Nobody interrupted. Richard continued. The coffee was my fault. My comments were my fault. Everything that followed was my fault. Danielle listened patiently. Marcus remained silent beside her. Richard finally looked directly at Danielle. I am sorry. For a few seconds, only the distant sound of music filled the room. Then Danielle smiled gently. Thank you for saying it. Richard seemed surprised by how simple her response was. Danielle glanced toward the ballroom around them. The coffee was never the real problem. Richard frowned slightly. Danielle continued. The assumption was. Her words settled over the room with quiet power. When we decide who someone is before learning their story, we reveal more about ourselves than we do about them. Several guests lowered their eyes. The lesson applied to more than one person. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. For the first time all evening, he truly understood. And standing beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people who had witnessed everything, he realized that the most valuable thing in the room had never been influence, status, or wealth. It had been character all along. The gala slowly began to return to life after Danielle's words settled over the room. Conversations resumed, but they sounded different now. Softer, more thoughtful. The polished confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier had given way to quiet reflection. Some guests returned to discussing business. Others stood near the windows looking out at the Manhattan skyline. Yet many found themselves replaying the evening in their minds. They remembered the coffee, They remembered the assumptions. Most of all, they remembered the grace with which Danielle Carter had handled every moment. Marcus remained beside her, occasionally greeting familiar faces, but his attention never drifted far from his wife. He could see the respect in the eyes of the people approaching her now. What impressed him most was that Danielle accepted that respect exactly the same way she had accepted the disrespect earlier in the evening. Calmly, without pride, without resentment. Near the refreshment station, the young waitress Danielle had helped earlier gathered enough courage to approach her one final time. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said. Danielle smiled warmly. "You never needed to thank me." The waitress glanced around the ballroom. "Most people here notice important people. You noticed me." Danielle gently touched her arm. "Everyone is important." The young woman smiled and walked away carrying that lesson with her. Across the room, Richard Coleman stood alone near one of the marble columns. Several guests had spoken with him since the apology, but he welcomed the brief solitude. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about profits, acquisitions, or influence. He was thinking about character. He watched Danielle from a distance as she spoke kindly with employees, donors, and guests alike. Nothing about her behavior had changed after her identity became known. That realization remained the most powerful lesson of all. Eventually, the evening drew to a close. Staff members began clearing tables. The musicians packed away their instruments. One by one, guests made their way toward the exits beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Marcus offered Danielle his arm. She accepted it with a smile. Together, they walked toward the grand entrance. As they passed through the ballroom, many guests nodded respectfully. Danielle returned every greeting with the same genuine kindness she had shown from the beginning. When they reached the doors, she paused briefly and looked back. Her eyes met Richard's for a moment. There was no anger there, no triumph, only understanding. Richard nodded quietly. Danielle returned the gesture before turning away. Outside, the cool night air welcomed them. Manhattan stretched endlessly before them, alive with light and motion. Reflections shimmered across the streets after a brief evening rain. Marcus placed his jacket more securely around Danielle's shoulders as they walked toward the waiting car. Neither spoke for several moments. They did not need to. Behind them, through the towering glass windows, Richard remained standing inside the ballroom. He watched their figures disappear into the city lights. The coffee stain had long since ceased to matter. The wealth had ceased to matter. The titles had ceased to matter. What remained was a lesson far more valuable than anything discussed that evening. Some people reveal their worth the moment they enter a room. Others reveal it through every choice they make. And as the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass and the final guests drifted into the night, the silence left behind carried the unmistakable sound of justice.